The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan valley as Lieutenant Sarah Chen adjusted her tactical gear one final time. The air was crisp and thin at this altitude, making every breath feel precious. She had been deployed with SEAL Team 7 for 6 months now, the only female operator in a unit of 12 elite soldiers. Today's mission was supposed to be routine, a reconnaissance patrol to gather intelligence on enemy movement patterns in the Helmand province. Sarah checked her rifle scope and scanned the terrain ahead. The valley stretched out before them like a natural amphitheater, with rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation dotting the landscape. Intel reports had indicated minimal enemy presence in this sector, which is why Command had green-lit their patrol route through this particular area. The team was tasked with establishing observation posts and monitoring a suspected supply route used by insurgent forces. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, the team leader, gave the hand signal to move out. The 12-person team began their descent into the valley in a tactical formation. Sarah took point position on the left flank, her eyes constantly scanning for any signs of danger. The ground beneath their boots was hard-packed earth mixed with loose gravel that crunched softly with each step. As they moved deeper into the valley, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The vegetation pattern seemed unusual, too uniform, too deliberately placed. Years of training had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about this area felt wrong. She raised her fist to signal a halt and dropped to one knee, studying the ground more carefully. The other team members immediately took defensive positions, their weapons ready. Chief Rodriguez moved up to Sarah's position, keeping low to avoid skylining himself against the ridge behind them. His weathered face showed concern as he whispered, "What do you see, Chen?" Sarah pointed to a patch of ground about 20 meters ahead. "The grass pattern, Chief. Look how it's been disturbed and then replanted. And see those small mounds of earth? They're too regular to be natural." Her voice was steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. Rodriguez pulled out his binoculars and studied the area Sarah had indicated. After a long moment, he cursed under his breath. "You're right. Looks like we've stumbled into a minefield." He immediately activated his radio to contact Base Command. "Overwatch, this is Team 7. We have a potential mine situation, requesting explosive ordnance disposal support and guidance." The radio crackled with static before the response came through. "Team 7, be advised EOD is 2 hours out from your position. Maintain current location and do not advance until support arrives." The team settled into defensive positions along the ridgeline, but their situation was far from secure. They were exposed on 3 sides, with the suspected minefield blocking their primary exit route. Worse, intelligence reports were coming in over the radio about increased enemy activity in the surrounding areas. What had started as a routine patrol was quickly becoming a potential trap. As the hours passed, the team's water supplies began to dwindle. The Afghan sun climbed higher, turning their rocky position into an oven. Sarah used her sniper scope to continuously scan the surrounding hills for any signs of enemy movement. Through the heat shimmer rising from the valley floor, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. "Chief, we've got company," she whispered into her radio. 3 o'clock, approximately 800 meters. "I count at least 15 hostiles moving in our direction." Rodriguez quickly confirmed the sighting through his own optics. The enemy fighters were using the terrain expertly, moving from cover to cover as they advanced toward the SEAL team's position. It was clear they knew about the Americans' presence and were moving to surround them. "Overwatch, this is Team 7. Rodriguez spoke urgently into his radio. "We have multiple hostiles approaching our position. We need immediate air support and fast extraction. Our exit route is compromised by the minefield." The response from Command was not what they wanted to hear. "Team 7, air support is engaged with another situation. EOD team is still 90 minutes out. You need to hold your position." Sarah watched through her scope as the enemy fighters continued their advance. They were skilled and disciplined, clearly not the typical insurgent fighters the team usually encountered. These looked like experienced Taliban fighters who knew exactly what they were doing. They were setting up positions that would give them overlapping fields of fire on the SEAL team's location. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Trapped between a minefield and advancing enemy forces with no immediate support available, the team was running out of options. Sarah could see the tension on her teammates' faces as they realized the gravity of their predicament. As the enemy fighters moved closer, Sporadic gunfire began to echo across the valley. The Taliban forces were testing the Americans' positions, trying to gauge their strength and defensive capabilities. Chief Rodriguez made the difficult decision to return fire, knowing that once the shooting started, there would be no going back. The first exchange of gunfire lasted only a few minutes, but it confirmed everyone's worst fears. The enemy had superior numbers and better positioning. They were systematically working to cut off any escape routes and pin the SEAL team down in their current location. Sarah checked her ammunition count and water supply. Both were getting dangerously low. She looked at her teammates and saw the same grim determination in their eyes that she felt in her own heart. They were professional warriors trained for exactly this type of situation, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. As the afternoon wore on, the intensity of the firefight increased. The enemy forces had managed to move closer under cover of coordinated suppressive fire. Sarah realized that within the next few hours their position would become completely untenable. They needed to find a way out of this valley, and the only route available was through the minefield that had trapped them in the first place. Looking out at the dangerous ground ahead, Sarah began to form a plan. It was risky, potentially deadly, but it might be their only chance. She studied the pattern of the mines she could identify, looking for any possible safe passage through the deadly field. The fate of her entire team might depend on what she decided to do next. The afternoon heat was becoming unbearable as Sarah carefully studied the minefield through her rifle scope. Each disturbed patch of earth could hide an explosive device capable of killing or maiming anyone who stepped on it. She had been trained in mine detection during her specialized warfare course, but classroom theory was vastly different from the life-or-death reality she now faced. Chief Rodriguez crawled over to her position, keeping his head low as bullets whined overhead. "Chen, what are you thinking?" "I can see those wheels turning in your head." His voice was calm despite their desperate situation, a testament to his years of combat experience. Sarah lowered her scope and turned to face him. "Chief, I think I can see a pattern in the mine placement. Look at the way they've positioned them. There's a natural pathway that curves around the larger concentrations. If we move single file and follow my lead, we might be able to navigate through." Rodriguez studied her face carefully. He had learned to trust his team members' expertise, and Sarah had already proven her worth by spotting the minefield in the first place. "It's a hell of a risk, Chen. One wrong step and—" "I know the risks, Chief," Sarah interrupted. "But staying here isn't an option either. Those Taliban fighters are getting closer, and we're running low on everything. In another hour, they'll be able to overrun our position." As if to emphasize her point, a fresh volley of gunfire erupted from the enemy positions. The bullets struck the rocks around them, sending sharp fragments flying through the air. Petty Officer Jake Sullivan, positioned on the far right flank, called out over the radio. "Chief, I've got movement on the East Ridge. They're trying to flank us." The tactical situation was becoming impossible. The enemy had superior numbers and were systematically closing off escape routes. Sarah watched as muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around the valley. The Taliban fighters were well coordinated and experienced. Nothing like the disorganized insurgents the team had encountered in previous operations. "Overwatch, this is Team 7. Rodriguez spoke into his radio with increasing urgency. "We need immediate extraction. Our position is being overrun." "Where's that EOD support?" The response came back filled with static and bad news. "Team 7, EOD is delayed due to enemy activity on the route. Air support is still unavailable. You need to hold your position until we can get assets to you." Sarah felt her jaw clench with frustration. Command was asking them to hold an untenable position with no support. She looked at her teammates and saw the same realization dawning on their faces. They were on their own, and conventional military doctrine wasn't going to save them. "Chief," she said, grabbing Rodriguez's arm, "we can't wait for support that might never come. I'm going to probe the minefield and see if I can find us a way through." Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment. As team leader, he was responsible for every person under his command. Authorizing Sarah to enter the minefield went against every protocol and safety measure in the military handbook. But sometimes desperate situations called for desperate measures. "Absolutely not," he said firmly. "I can't authorize that kind of risk. If you're wrong about the pattern, you're dead and will still be trapped." Sarah understood his position, but she also understood their tactical reality. "Chief, with respect, we're already dead if we stay here." "At least this way we have a chance." She began checking her equipment, making sure everything was secured and wouldn't make noise as she moved. The gunfire intensified as the Taliban forces pressed their attack. Sergeant Mike Thompson, operating the team's communications equipment, shouted over the noise. "Chief, I'm picking up radio chatter. They're calling in reinforcements. We're going to have company from multiple directions within the hour." That information changed everything. Rodriguez realized that Sarah was right. Staying in their current position was essentially suicide. He made the hardest decision of his military career. "All right, Chen, but you're not going alone. I'll follow 20 meters behind you. If you find a safe path, the rest of the team comes through single file. If something goes wrong..." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. Sarah nodded and began her final equipment check. She removed everything non-essential from her gear, keeping only her rifle, ammunition, water, and basic medical supplies. Every ounce of weight mattered when you were trying to move silently through a field of buried explosives. She studied the ground ahead one more time, memorizing the subtle signs that indicated safe passage. The patterns of disturbed earth, the placement of rocks and vegetation, the slight depressions that might indicate buried devices, all of it had to be cataloged and remembered. "Remember," Rodriguez said quietly, "slow and steady. Test each step before you commit your full weight. If you see anything that doesn't look right, stop immediately." Sarah took a deep breath and began her descent toward the minefield. Behind her, she could hear her teammates laying down suppressive fire to keep the enemy forces at bay. Each step felt like it took an eternity as she carefully placed her feet on what she hoped was safe ground. The first 20 meters were the most terrifying of her life. Every small sound, the crunch of gravel under her boots, the whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation, seemed amplified to dangerous levels. She moved with deliberate precision, testing each footfall before committing her weight. As she reached the edge of what she believed was the main minefield, Sarah felt sweat running down her face despite the dry air. She turned and gave Rodriguez the hand signal to follow. Behind him, the rest of the team was watching anxiously, their weapons trained on the surrounding hills to provide cover. Rodriguez began his own careful movement toward Sarah's position. The enemy fire was increasing in intensity, and Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions around the valley. Time was running out, and they still had the most dangerous part of the minefield ahead of them. The path Sarah had identified curved around several suspicious mounds of earth and followed a natural depression in the ground. It would take them parallel to the enemy positions for several hundred meters before turning toward their extraction point. During that movement, they would be completely exposed to enemy fire with no cover except the hope that the Taliban fighters wouldn't risk shooting into their own minefield. As Rodriguez reached her position, Sarah pointed out the route she intended to take. "It's going to take us right through the middle, Chief, but I think it's our only shot." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Lead the way, Chen. The team is counting on you." Sarah's heart pounded as she took her first step into what she was certain was an active minefield. The ground beneath her feet felt different somehow, as if it held deadly secrets just inches below the surface. Every fiber of her training screamed warnings about what she was attempting, but the increasing gunfire behind them confirmed there was no other choice. She moved with extreme deliberation, placing each foot carefully on solid-looking ground while avoiding any area that appeared disturbed. The path she had identified from her elevated position looked different at ground level. What had seemed like clear passage from above now revealed subtle signs of danger, small depressions that could indicate buried pressure plates, areas where the soil looked too loose or recently turned. Rodriguez followed 20 meters behind, matching her pace exactly and stepping only where she had stepped. Behind him, the rest of the team maintained their defensive perimeter, but Sarah could hear the strain in their voices as they called out enemy positions. The Taliban forces were getting bolder, moving closer to the team's original position. "Contact left," Sergeant Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. "They're trying to rush our flank." The sound of automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. Sarah forced herself to focus on the ground ahead, trusting her teammates to handle the firefight while she navigated the deadly terrain. A stray bullet whined overhead, reminding her that they faced death from above as well as below. 30 meters into the minefield, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. The natural depression she had been following disappeared into a cluster of suspicious mounds. Each mound was roughly the size and shape that would conceal an anti-personnel mine. She stopped and studied the area carefully, looking for any sign of safe passage. "What's the holdup, Chen?" Rodriguez whispered into his radio. "Multiple possible devices ahead, Chief. I need a minute to read the terrain." Sarah used her rifle scope to study the ground more carefully. In the distance, she could see where the depression resumed on the far side of the dangerous area. The question was how to get there safely. She noticed that several small rocks had been placed in what appeared to be a random pattern among the mounds. But as she studied them more carefully, Sarah realized the placement wasn't random at all. The rocks formed a subtle zigzag pattern that avoided the most obvious mine locations. Someone had marked a safe path through this section. "Chief, I think someone else has been through here before. There are marker stones showing a route." Sarah began following the stone pattern, testing each step even more carefully than before. If she was wrong about the markers, she would discover her mistake in the most final way possible. The zigzag path took her dangerously close to several of the mounds, but the stone markers proved accurate. Each step on the marked route felt solid and safe. As she reached the far side of the obstacle, Sarah felt a moment of relief. They were roughly halfway through the minefield, and her theory about the safe passage was proving correct. Rodriguez reached her position and studied the path ahead. "Good work, Chen. How much more do we have?" "Maybe 200 meters to clear terrain. But the next section looks tricky." Sarah pointed to an area where the ground sloped downward toward a small stream bed. The natural watershed had carved a channel through the valley floor, and the approaches to it showed clear signs of mine placement. Behind them, the firefight was intensifying. Petty Officer Williams called out over the radio, "Chief, we're taking heavy fire from multiple directions. They've got us bracketed. We need to move now." The urgency in Williams's voice confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The enemy forces had closed the net around their original position. The rest of the team would have to follow through the minefield soon or they would be overrun. "Send the next man," Rodriguez ordered over the radio. "Single file, step exactly where we stepped. Chen will guide us through the rest." Sarah watched as Petty Officer Sullivan began his careful movement toward their position. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his body language as he navigated the marked path. Behind him, the remaining team members continued their defensive fire, but their position was becoming increasingly untenable. As Sullivan approached the halfway point, Sarah turned her attention to the streambed ahead. The approaches were definitely mined, but the streambed itself looked clear. Water would naturally wash away any buried devices, and the rocky bottom would make mine placement difficult. If they could reach the stream, it might provide both safe passage and concealment from enemy fire. "Chief, I think our best bet is to get to that stream bed. The water should be clean, and it'll give us cover for the final approach to the extraction point." Rodriguez studied the terrain with his binoculars. "Agreed, but getting there is the problem. Those approaches are definitely mined." Sarah had already identified what she believed was the safest route to the water. It required following a natural ridge line that curved around the most obvious mine placements. The ridge looked like it had been used as a footpath in the past, worn smooth by generations of local travelers who would have known to avoid the dangerous areas. She began the descent toward the streambed, moving even more carefully than before. The slope made each step more treacherous, as loose soil could trigger devices that might be stable on level ground. Halfway down the slope, her foot dislodged a small rock that rolled into one of the suspicious areas. The explosion that followed was deafening. Dirt and rocks flew in all directions as an anti-personnel mine detonated just meters from Sarah's position. The blast wave knocked her flat, and for a moment her world went silent except for a high-pitched ringing in her ears. "Chen! Chen, report!" Rodriguez's voice seemed to come from very far away. Sarah pushed herself up from the ground and checked for injuries. Miraculously, she was unhurt except for some minor cuts from flying debris. The explosion had actually helped by revealing the exact location of one mine cluster, allowing her to adjust her route accordingly. "I'm okay, Chief, but we definitely have active devices down here." Sarah resumed her careful movement toward the streambed, now hyper-aware of every step. The explosion had also alerted the enemy forces to their exact location. Gunfire began to impact the area around the minefield as Taliban fighters tried to pin them down. The race was now against time. Sarah had to get her team through the remaining minefield before the enemy could bring enough firepower to bear on their exposed position. Behind her, she could hear Rodriguez urging the next team member to move faster. while still maintaining safety protocols. As Sarah finally reached the rocky stream bed, she felt a moment of triumph. The water was shallow but clear, and the rocky bottom showed no signs of explosive devices. She turned and signaled for Rodriguez to follow her route exactly. "Clear route to the stream, Chief. Send them through fast." The stream bed provided the cover they desperately needed. Sarah began moving upstream toward their planned extraction point, keeping low to avoid being silhouetted against the sky. Behind her, she could hear her teammates beginning their own dangerous journey through the minefield she had just navigated. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance gave her hope. Perhaps their extraction was finally arriving, but they still had to reach the landing zone alive. And between them and safety lay the final, most dangerous section of the minefield. The sound of helicopters grew louder as Sarah moved through the shallow stream bed, but she knew better than to feel relief yet. The rocky creek provided excellent concealment from enemy fire, but it also channeled them toward an area where the minefield would be at its most concentrated, the natural choke point where anyone trying to escape the valley would have to pass. Rodriguez reached the stream bed and immediately took cover behind a large boulder. "How many more do we have coming through?" he called out over the radio. "7 more team members still on the ridge," came Sullivan's reply. "Williams and Jackson are providing covering fire while the others move through your marked route." Sarah studied the terrain ahead while waiting for the rest of the team. The stream bed curved around a rocky outcropping and then opened into a small clearing where their extraction helicopters would attempt to land. Intelligence reports had indicated this area was clear, but those same reports had failed to mention the extensive minefield they were currently navigating. "Chief, I don't like the look of that clearing ahead," Sarah said, pointing upstream. "It's too perfect. Exactly where you'd put mines if you wanted to stop people from reaching an extraction point." Rodriguez raised his binoculars and studied the area. The clearing was roughly 50 meters across, with level ground perfect for helicopter landings. It was also completely open, with no cover except for a few scattered rocks. If it was mined, anyone attempting to cross it would be completely exposed. The radio crackled with urgent updates from the team members still fighting their way through the original position. "Contact rear. They're trying to cut off our escape route." Sergeant Thompson's voice was strained with the effort of coordinating defensive fire while managing his radio equipment. "How long until extraction arrives?" Rodriguez asked into his radio. "Overwatch estimates 15 minutes for the birds to reach your position. Be advised, heavy enemy activity reported throughout the area. Extraction will be hot." 15 minutes felt like an eternity given their current situation. Sarah watched as the third team member began navigating the minefield behind them. Each person's movement through the dangerous terrain took precious time, and the enemy forces were adapting to their escape attempt. A new sound echoed across the valley, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The Taliban fighters had brought heavier weapons into play, and they were targeting the area around the stream bed. The first explosion landed 50 meters upstream, sending water and debris cascading down toward Sarah's position. "They're bracketing us with mortars," Rodriguez shouted over the noise. "We need to move faster." Sarah knew he was right, but rushing through a minefield was suicide. She had to balance speed with safety, getting her team through the remaining obstacles without triggering the devices that could kill them all. The next mortar round landed closer and she felt the pressure wave wash over her position. "Chief, I'm going to scout the clearing while we wait for the others. If it's mined, I need to find us a safe route before the helicopters arrive." Sarah began moving upstream before Rodriguez could object to her plan. The stream bed provided concealment for most of the approach to the clearing, but the final 20 meters required crossing open ground. Sarah studied the area carefully, looking for the telltale signs of mine placement she had learned to recognize. The soil looked undisturbed in most places, but there were several patches that appeared suspiciously uniform. As she reached the edge of the clearing, Sarah spotted something that made her blood run cold. Partially concealed among the rocks were the remains of previous extraction attempts, pieces of military equipment and personal gear scattered by explosive blasts. This clearing had been used before and it had been deadly. "Chief, negative on the clearing. I can see evidence of previous mine strikes. We need an alternate route." Rodriguez's response was immediate. "Roger that. Find us another way out." Sarah studied the terrain around the clearing, looking for any alternative approach to a helicopter landing zone. The valley walls were too steep for aircraft operations, and the areas of level ground were all showing signs of mine placement. They were trapped in an increasingly small area as enemy forces closed in from multiple directions. Then she spotted something promising. About 200 meters north of the primary clearing was a smaller area of flat ground. It was barely large enough for one helicopter, but it showed no obvious signs of mine placement. More importantly, it could be approached through a series of natural rock formations that would provide cover from enemy fire. "Chief, I think I found us an alternate LZ. It's smaller, but it looks clean." "Show me," Rodriguez replied, moving up to her position while the fourth team member began his traverse of the minefield behind them. Sarah pointed out the alternate landing zone and the approach route she had identified. The path required climbing over several large boulders and crossing some exposed ground, but it avoided the heavily mined areas around the primary clearing. Rodriguez studied the route through his binoculars. "It's risky, but better than trying to cross that killing field. I'll call it into Overwatch." As Rodriguez coordinated with the extraction helicopters, Sarah continued to observe the enemy positions around the valley. The Taliban forces had established a loose perimeter around their area, but they seemed reluctant to advance too close to the minefield. That reluctance was the only thing keeping the SEAL team alive. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed from their original position as the remaining team members fought to break contact and follow the escape route. Each burst of gunfire reminded Sarah that her teammates were still in mortal danger, and any delay in the extraction could be fatal. "Overwatch confirms they can reach the alternate LZ," Rodriguez reported. "Birds will be on station in 10 minutes. We need everyone through the minefield and in position by then." Sarah watched as the fifth team member reached the stream bed. The process was taking too long, and enemy fire was getting more accurate as the Taliban forces adjusted their aim. Another mortar round exploded near the team's original position, followed immediately by sustained small arms fire. "Contact! Contact!" Williams' voice came over the radio with desperate urgency. "They're rushing our position. We need immediate support." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah realized that the remaining team members might not have time to navigate the minefield safely. The enemy forces were making their final push to overrun the American position before the extraction helicopters could arrive. "Chief, we need to lay down covering fire to buy the others time," Sarah said, positioning herself behind a large rock that offered a clear field of fire back toward the team's original position. Rodriguez nodded and began setting up his own firing position. All team members in the stream bed prepared to provide covering fire for the remaining personnel. Sarah chambered around and began acquiring targets through her rifle scope. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different enemy positions as Taliban fighters pressed their attack on the remaining SEAL team members. The distance was extreme for accurate rifle fire, but any suppression they could provide might give their teammates the breathing room they needed to escape. As Sarah squeezed the trigger for her first shot, she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors getting closer. The extraction birds were approaching, but the landing zone was still not secure. The next few minutes would determine whether the entire team made it out alive, or whether their mission would end in the Afghan valley that had already claimed so many lives. The race between rescue and destruction was about to reach its climax, and everything depended on the remaining team members successfully navigating the deadly ground that had nearly claimed them all. The crack of Sarah's rifle echoed across the valley as she engaged enemy targets from her position in the stream bed. Through her scope, she could see the muzzle flashes of Taliban fighters who were pressing their attack on the remaining SEAL team members. Her accurate fire forced several enemy fighters to take cover, providing precious seconds for her teammates to continue their escape. "Good hits, Chen," Rodriguez called out as he fired his own weapon. "Keep them pinned down." The sound of helicopter rotors was getting much louder now, and Sarah could see the distinctive silhouettes of 2 Blackhawks approaching from the south. The aircraft were flying low and fast, using the terrain to mask their approach from enemy air defenses, but they would still need several minutes to reach the alternate landing zone and set up for extraction. Over the radio, Sarah could hear the desperation in her teammates' voices as they fought to break contact with the enemy forces. "This is Williams. Jackson's hit. We need immediate extraction." The news that one of their team members was wounded changed everything. Rodriguez immediately switched frequencies to communicate directly with the incoming helicopters. Blackbird 1, this is Team 7. We have one wounded and need immediate medical evacuation. Can you provide covering fire on approach? Team 7, this is Blackbird 1, came the pilot's response. We see your position and are moving to provide close air support. Keep your heads down. The lead helicopter swung wide around the valley and Sarah could see the door gunners preparing their weapons. Within seconds, the aircraft's machine guns opened fire on the Taliban positions, sending long streams of tracers into the enemy concentrations. The suppressive fire was devastating and immediate in its effect. The enemy small arms fire slackened noticeably as fighters scrambled for better cover. Now. Move now, Rodriguez shouted over the radio to the remaining team members. Sarah watched through her scope as Williams and Thompson helped carry the wounded Jackson through the minefield. They were moving faster than was safe, but with helicopter support providing cover, speed was more important than caution. Behind them, Sullivan and Martinez provided rear guard action, firing and moving in coordinated bounds. The sixth team member reached the stream bed just as the second helicopter moved into position over the alternate landing zone. Sarah could see the aircraft settling into a low hover, with the crew chief scanning for threats while the pilots maintained position despite the swirling dust and debris. LZ is hot, the helicopter crew chief reported over the radio. We're taking small arms fire from the eastern ridge. Sarah immediately shifted her aim toward the reported threat and spotted several muzzle flashes among the rocks on the valley's eastern wall. The enemy fighters had managed to position themselves where they could engage the extraction helicopters, threatening the entire rescue operation. I've got eyes on the eastern shooters, Sarah reported, adjusting her scope for the longer range. Engaging now. Her first shot struck close to one of the enemy positions, sending rock fragments flying. The Taliban fighter immediately shifted position, but Sarah had marked his location and was ready when he exposed himself again. Her second shot found its target, and one threat was eliminated. Rodriguez was coordinating the final movement of team members through the minefield, while maintaining his own suppressive fire. Williams, you're clear to the stream bed. Thompson helped Jackson through that last section carefully. I don't care how much fire we're taking, don't rush the mines. The wounded Jackson was conscious but losing blood from a leg wound. Sarah could see Thompson applying pressure to the injury while Williams provided security. They were moving as fast as Jackson's condition allowed, but every second in the minefield increased their risk exponentially. Contact left, Martinez called out over the radio. They're trying to flank the LZ. Sarah swiveled her rifle toward the new threat and spotted a group of Taliban fighters attempting to work their way around to the north side of the landing zone. If they succeeded, they would have clear shots at the helicopter and could prevent the extraction. She began engaging them immediately, forcing them to take cover behind the rocky outcroppings. The helicopter pilots were displaying incredible skill, maintaining their position despite increasing ground fire and the challenging terrain. Sarah could see bullet impacts on the aircraft's armor plating, but the crew continued their mission with professional determination. Blackbird 2, this is Team 7, Rodriguez called to the second helicopter. We need you to suppress the northern approach to the LZ. We have hostiles trying to flank our extraction point. Roger. Team 7, we're moving to engage. The second helicopter swung around and began raking the northern ridgeline with machine gun fire. The combined firepower from both aircraft created a protective umbrella over the landing zone, but Sarah knew it couldn't last indefinitely. Helicopters were vulnerable to ground fire, and the enemy was adapting their tactics to counter the air support. Thompson and Williams finally reached the stream bed with the wounded Jackson. Sarah could see that Jackson's condition was deteriorating. He was pale and seemed to be going into shock from blood loss. They needed to get him to the helicopter and medical treatment immediately. Chief Jackson needs a medevac right now, Thompson reported over the radio. He's lost a lot of blood. Rodriguez made the command decision that would determine the success or failure of their extraction. All team members move to the LZ now. Sarah, you take point and get us to that helicopter. Thompson and Williams, get Jackson ready to move. Sarah slung her rifle and began the final approach to the alternate landing zone. The route she had identified earlier took them through a series of rock formations that provided some cover from enemy fire, but they would still be exposed during the final sprint to the helicopter. As she led her team out of the stream bed, Sarah could hear the increasing intensity of the firefight around them. The helicopter door gunners were engaging targets on multiple sides of the valley, and she could see tracers flying in both directions. The Taliban forces were making a final, desperate attempt to prevent the American extraction. The first 50 meters of the approach went smoothly, with the rock formations providing adequate cover. But as they neared the landing zone, Sarah realized they would have to cross 30 meters of completely open ground to reach the helicopter. During that crossing, they would be exposed to fire from several enemy positions. "Chief, we're going to have to make a run for it," Sarah called back to Rodriguez. "There's no cover for the final approach." "Roger that. On my mark, everyone runs for the bird. Don't stop for anything." Sarah positioned herself at the edge of the last rock formation and studied the helicopter landing zone. The aircraft was maintaining a stable hover about 3 feet off the ground, with the crew chief providing covering fire and directing their approach. The pilots were fighting to keep the aircraft steady despite the ground fire and swirling dust. Behind her, she could hear Williams and Thompson preparing to carry the wounded Jackson across the open ground. Sullivan and Martinez were checking their ammunition and preparing to provide covering fire during the sprint to safety. "Ready?" Rodriguez asked over the radio. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to make the most important run of her life. The helicopter represented safety and survival, but reaching it would require crossing ground that was swept by enemy fire. Everything they had endured in the minefield would be meaningless if they couldn't complete this final dash to extraction. "Ready?" "Chief," she replied, her hand on her rifle and her muscles coiled for action. "Go, go, go!" Rodriguez's command cracked over the radio like a whip. Sarah exploded from behind the rock formation and sprinted across the open ground toward the waiting helicopter. Her legs pumped with desperate efficiency as bullets whined through the air around her. The 30 meters of exposed ground felt like 30 miles as enemy fire intensified from multiple directions. Behind her, she could hear the heavy breathing and pounding footsteps of her teammates as they made their own desperate dash for safety. Williams and Thompson were carrying the wounded Jackson between them, moving as fast as his condition would allow. The sound of their labored breathing mixed with the helicopter's rotor wash and the crack of incoming rounds. 15 meters from the helicopter, Sarah saw dirt kicks up just inches from her feet as enemy bullets struck the ground. The Taliban fighters had zeroed in on the landing zone and were pouring accurate fire into the extraction point. The helicopter crew chief was leaning out of the aircraft, firing his machine gun in controlled bursts at the enemy positions, while gesturing frantically for the team to hurry. "Almost there," Sarah shouted over the noise, though she wasn't sure if anyone could hear her above the roar of engines and gunfire. As she reached the helicopter's side door, strong hands grabbed her and hauled her into the aircraft. The crew chief immediately turned his attention to helping the next team member while Sarah rolled to the far side of the cabin and prepared to provide covering fire through the opposite door. Rodriguez reached the helicopter next, diving through the door with bullets impacting the armor plating around the opening. "Where's Jackson?" he shouted to the crew chief. "Still coming," the crew chief replied, maintaining his suppressive fire on the enemy positions. Sarah could see Williams and Thompson struggling across the final meters with their wounded teammate. Jackson appeared to be unconscious now, his body limp between the two men carrying him. They were moving slower than the others, and the enemy fire was becoming more concentrated as the Taliban fighters realized the Americans were escaping. "Covering fire," Rodriguez ordered, and Sarah immediately began engaging targets through the helicopter's door. The helicopter's door gunners were providing devastating suppressive fire, but there were too many enemy positions for them to suppress effectively. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least 8 different locations around the valley rim. The Taliban forces had positioned themselves well, with overlapping fields of fire that covered the entire landing zone. Sullivan reached the helicopter and dove through the door, immediately grabbing ammunition to help with the covering fire. Behind him, Martinez was running backward while firing his rifle at pursuing enemy fighters, who had emerged from concealed positions closer to the landing zone. "They're right behind us," Martinez shouted as he reached the aircraft. Williams and Thompson were still 20 meters away, struggling with Jackson's weight and the uneven ground. Sarah could see that Thompson had been hit. There was blood on his left arm, but he was still supporting his wounded teammate and moving toward the helicopter. "Blackbird 2, we need immediate suppression on the southern ridge," Rodriguez called to the second helicopter. "We have wounded team members in the open." The second aircraft immediately responded, swinging around to engage the enemy positions that were threatening the final team members. Its machine guns raked the ridgeline with sustained fire, forcing the Taliban fighters to take cover and reducing the accuracy of their shots. But the suppressive fire came almost too late. As Williams and Thompson reached the final 10 meters, an enemy fighter appeared from behind a large boulder just 50 meters away. He was armed with an AK-47 and had a clear shot at the two men carrying their wounded teammate. Sarah saw the threat developing and immediately shifted her aim. The range was close, but the helicopter's movement and the swirling dust made the shot difficult. She had one chance to eliminate the threat before the enemy fighter could kill her teammates. Her rifle cracked once, and the Taliban fighter spun and fell. But more enemy fighters were emerging from concealed positions around the landing zone. The extraction was turning into a running gun battle, with American and Taliban forces engaged at point-blank range. "Get them in here now," the pilot shouted over the intercom. "We're taking too much fire. I can't hold this position much longer." Williams and Thompson reached the helicopter with Jackson, and multiple hands reached out to pull all three men into the aircraft. The crew chief immediately began working on Jackson's wounds while Rodriguez helped Thompson with his arm injury. "That's everyone," Rodriguez called to the pilot. "Get us out of here." But even as the helicopter began to lift off, enemy fire continued to pour into the landing zone. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the aircraft and the metallic ring of impacts on the armor plating. Through the door, she could see Taliban fighters running toward their position, trying to get close enough for accurate shots at the rising helicopter. "Taking fire from multiple directions," the pilot reported. "Hang on, this is going to be rough." The helicopter climbed rapidly, while executing evasive maneuvers to avoid the ground fire. Sarah was pressed against the cabin wall by the G-forces as the aircraft banked sharply to the left, then immediately rolled right to avoid a concentration of enemy fighters. As they gained altitude, Sarah looked down at the valley that had nearly become their grave. She could see the minefield they had traversed, marked now by the crater from the explosion that had almost killed her. The stream bed that had provided their concealment was clearly visible, as were the Taliban positions that had nearly overrun them. The crew chief was working frantically on Jackson's injuries, applying pressure bandages and starting an IV line. Thompson's arm wound was less serious, but he was losing blood and needed medical attention. Both wounded men would need immediate surgery once they reached the military hospital. "How long to the medical facility?" Rodriguez asked the crew chief. 20 minutes to Bagram," came the reply. "We've already called ahead. Medical team will be standing by." Sarah finally allowed herself to feel some relief as the helicopter gained altitude and distance from the valley. They had all made it out alive, though the cost had been high. Jackson's condition was still critical, and Thompson needed medical treatment for his wounds. As Afghanistan's rugged landscape passed beneath them, Sarah reflected on the events of the past several hours. Her decision to probe the minefield had saved the entire team from being overrun by superior enemy forces. The skills she had learned in explosive ordnance training, combined with careful observation and calculated risk-taking, had provided the crucial edge that allowed their escape. "Hell of a job back there." "Chen," Rodriguez said, settling into the seat beside her. "That minefield would have stopped anyone else cold." "How did you know?" Sarah considered the question as she watched the Afghan mountains scroll past below. Training helped, but mostly it was just paying attention to details. The patterns were there if you knew what to look for, but she knew it had been more than training and observation. It had taken courage to make that first step into the minefield, knowing that a single mistake would be fatal. It had required the trust of her teammates who had followed her lead through the deadly terrain, and it had demanded the kind of split-second decision-making that separated elite operators from ordinary soldiers. The helicopter banked toward Bagram Air Base, carrying its cargo of exhausted but alive American warriors. Behind them, the valley in Helmand province returned to its eternal silence, keeping its secrets and waiting for the next group of soldiers to test their skills against its hidden dangers. For Sarah Chen, the mission would become a defining moment in her military career, but for now she was simply grateful to be alive and heading home with her entire team intact. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the sterile corridors of Walter Reed Medical Center, holding a small bouquet of flowers as she made her way to room 347. The familiar smell of hospital disinfectant brought back memories of those first terrifying hours after their extraction, when Jackson's life had hung in the balance and Thompson's arm injury had threatened his military career. She knocked softly on the door before entering. Jackson was sitting up in bed, his left leg elevated and wrapped in bandages, but his eyes were bright and alert. The multiple surgeries had been successful, and while he would face months of physical therapy, doctors were confident he would make a full recovery. "Hey there, Minesweeper," Jackson said with a grin, using the nickname the team had given Sarah after their harrowing escape. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Sarah set the flowers on his bedside table and pulled up a chair. "Had to make sure you weren't milking this injury for sympathy. Thompson said you've been telling the nurses you're a war hero." "Damn right I am." Jackson laughed, then grew more serious. "We all are. That valley should have been our last mission, Sarah. What you did out there. I don't think any of us really understood how close we came to not making it home." The after-action reports had confirmed what Sarah suspected during their escape. Intelligence had severely underestimated both the extent of the minefield and the strength of enemy forces in the area. The Taliban had been using the valley as a major supply route and had heavily fortified it with mines and defensive positions. The SEAL team had walked into what was essentially a prepared killing ground. "Any word on Thompson's arm?" Sarah asked, changing the subject away from the praise she still felt uncomfortable receiving. "Full recovery expected. He's already back to light duty and driving the physical therapist crazy with his demands to return to full operations." Jackson shifted position carefully, mindful of his healing injuries. "Rodriguez put him in for a Purple Heart along with me." "But you know what the real story is?" Sarah did know. The official reports credited the team's successful extraction to superior training, tactical flexibility, and effective use of available assets. But everyone who had been in that valley knew the truth. Without Sarah's decision to probe the minefield and find a safe passage, the entire team would have been killed or captured. "Chief told me he put you in for the Silver Star," Jackson continued. "Said it was the least he could do for someone who saved 12 lives with pure courage and skill." The Silver Star recommendation was still working its way through the military bureaucracy. But Sarah wasn't focused on medals. The real reward was sitting right in front of her. A teammate who was alive because of the choices she had made under pressure. All 12 members of the team had returned home, and that was worth more than any decoration. "Rodriguez also told me something else," Jackson said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Command is looking at promoting you. Word is they want to put you in charge of your own team." The prospect of leading her own SEAL team was both exciting and terrifying. Sarah had proven herself in combat, but leadership brought new challenges and responsibilities. She would be responsible not just for her own decisions, but for the lives of every person under her command. "What do you think about that?" she asked Jackson. "I think any team would be lucky to have you as their leader. You've got the skills, the courage, and most importantly, the judgment to bring people home safely." Jackson's expression grew serious. "That minefield wasn't just about technical knowledge, Sarah. It was about making decisions when there were no good options available. That's what leadership is really about." Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Washington, D.C. skyline. Somewhere in the Pentagon, military planners were already developing new missions and identifying new threats. The war in Afghanistan would continue, and American Special Operations Forces would continue to face deadly challenges in hostile terrain. "The team's getting a new assignment," she said without turning around. "Classified, but Rodriguez hinted it's somewhere in Africa. Insurgent activity requiring our particular skill set. And you'll be with them?" Sarah turned back to face Jackson. "That's the question, isn't it? Stay with the team I know or take on new challenges and responsibilities." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. The events in the Afghan valley had changed all of them in subtle ways. They had faced death together and survived through teamwork, training, and a willingness to take calculated risks when conventional tactics weren't sufficient. A knock on the door interrupted their reflection. Thompson entered, his left arm still in a sling but moving with his characteristic energy and confidence. Behind him came Rodriguez and several other team members, all wearing civilian clothes and carrying various gifts and food items. "Figured we'd have an impromptu team meeting," Rodriguez announced, setting a box of Jackson's favorite donuts on the bedside table. "Besides, I've got some news to share." The team gathered around Jackson's bed, falling into the easy camaraderie that had kept them alive through multiple deployments. Sarah watched the interaction and realized how much these men meant to her. They had become more than teammates. They were family bound together by shared danger and mutual trust. "First, the good news," Rodriguez began. Jackson's medical board cleared him for return to duty, pending completion of physical therapy. Thompson's arm is healing ahead of schedule, and Sarah's Silver Star recommendation has been approved. The team erupted in congratulations and good-natured ribbing about Sarah's heroic status. She felt herself blushing but accepted their praise gracefully. These men had followed her through a minefield based on nothing more than trust and professional respect. Their approval meant everything to her. Now the other news, Rodriguez continued, his tone becoming more serious. Command has offered Sarah leadership of her own team. The assignment would be immediate with deployment in 6 months. The room fell silent as everyone processed this information. Sarah had known this moment would come, but hearing it officially announced made the decision real and immediate. "What do you think, Chen?" Sullivan asked. "Ready to be the boss?" Sarah looked around at the faces of her teammates, men who had trusted her with their lives and whom she had led to safety, through one of the most dangerous situations any of them had ever faced. The answer came to her with surprising clarity. "I think I'm ready," she said quietly. "It's time to find out what else I'm capable of." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Good, because the world's a dangerous place, and it needs more leaders who know how to bring people home safely." As the team continued their informal reunion, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. From that terrifying first step into the minefield to this hospital room, where her wounded teammates were recovering, she had proven to herself and others that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to act despite fear when action was necessary. The minefield in Afghanistan had been just the beginning. Now she would face new challenges as a leader, responsible for training and guiding the next generation of special operations warriors. But whatever dangers lay ahead, she would face them with the same careful observation, calculated risk-taking, and unwavering commitment to bringing her people home that had saved 12 lives in a valley half a world away. The war would continue, but Sarah Chen was ready for whatever came next.